I've been hearing some people say that this film's premise sounds very familiar. I mean, what exactly is familiar about a story about a small group of astronauts in a space station slowly being taken out one by someone in their own group who's not exactly who they claim to be? Oh, that's right, Alien! The similarities are just uncanny. Alright, before we get started, as always, a quick thank you to my patrons over on Patreon. If you enjoy the content I make and would like to offer your support, then for as little as $1 a month, you can get your name listed right here at the start of every video. Link to that is in the description below. And now, let's get into the actual review.
The Russians got the same orders as this. And they just struck first.
Struck first?
I.S.S. tells the story of a small group of astronauts, 3 Americans and 3 Russians, who are aboard the International Space Station. They work together, live together, and above all get along really well. But then one day nuclear war breaks down below, and the Americans receive an order. Take control of the I.S.S. by any means necessary. An adage I've always been a big fan of, particularly when it comes to film, is keep it simple. While there is definitely a place for complex stories with tons of twists and turns and big set pieces, sometimes all you need is a group of characters in one location, and that's it. And sometimes if you get too fancy, you wind up having too many moving parts and being unable to tie them all together. And honestly, you really can't get any simpler than this setup. There are only 6 characters in the film, and it takes place in one location. And I'm a real sucker for those kinds of stories. But I saw some of the early reactions to the film, and I thought, man, it can't be that bad, can it? Now, in fairness, I think the reason why audiences didn't respond to this film is because I think people went in thinking like this was going to be some kind of mystery film. Like, you're aware that somebody is behind all the weird things and attempted killings that's going on, almost like this is a slasher set in space, or a live-action Among Us adaptation. And that's not really what this is. For the most part, we are privy to what's going on as it's happening, and even with stuff where we're not told directly what's going on, it's really not that difficult to guess. And I'll admit, I was kind of disappointed by this at first as well, because I was thinking to myself, man, wouldn't it be cool to be put in the shoes of the main character, not really knowing who to trust or what's going on, or even if something is going on? You know, just really exploit the paranoia endemic to this premise. But at the same time, I do have to acknowledge that for this story and with this message that it's going for, which is that had people been more honest and open about what was going on from the start, a lot of issues could have been avoided. And so in this instance, the dramatic irony might actually be the best way to go. But I can get the frustration that people go into this thinking that it's going to be one thing, and then you're not really given that. So I'm just letting you know right from the get-go that this really isn't the film that the trailers or even the people claiming that this is basically just Among Us are insinuating that it is. But what I personally did appreciate about this film was its succinctness. It doesn't really waste time, it keeps the plot moving and manages to tell the story that it wants to tell in 90 minutes. The movie's not really trying to trick you into thinking the story is more complex or deep than it really is, and it doesn't take forever for the story to really kick into gear. Every section more or less feels like it's devoted to just the right amount of time needed. The setup, the build-up, the climax, all that good stuff. The script was clearly written by somebody who has good storytelling instincts. The characters are mostly really solid, they're given just the amount of depth so that they actually feel like real people, and the motivations for the characters don't really feel forced. You do understand why these characters wind up taking the actions that they do, even if you don't agree with it. While I think calling them 3-dimensional characters would be a step too far, they are definitely maybe 2.5-dimensional characters. And because most of these characters are likable, it does go a long way in emphasizing the tragedy of the situation. And while the film was clearly written to capitalize on current events, particularly with the growing tensions between the United States and Russia following the Ukraine crisis, the film is written in such a way that you don't need to be aware of said conflict in order to get anything out of the story. It does more or less stand on its own, distanced from current events. Now, are there issues? Of course, like you would expect. the plot is contingent on astronauts acting in ways that I do not believe that real astronauts would. These guys are supposed to have nerves of steel, and some of them are prone to panicking more than you would expect, so that's distracting. Out of the 6 characters, one of the Russian characters doesn't really get that much depth and is just kinda there. I also feel like the film does strain credulity with getting characters alone when they really shouldn't. Like, at one point, one of the characters goes out into the cold vacuum of space by himself to fix an antenna, and most of these characters kind of just disperse and go off to do their own thing. Now, I'm not a space expert, but I'm pretty sure the proper protocol would dictate that all of them would be on deck, keeping an eye out and working through the problem, just in case something goes wrong. And the way certain characters are taken out of the picture, so to speak, don't feel particularly satisfying or earned. There's one scene in particular that feels so rushed that it lacks the emotional gut punch that it's going for, especially since the scene is supposed to serve as the thematic center of the entire film. It didn't really feel properly built up, both within the scene and the film as a whole. And while the film does look fine for the most part, every once in a while there are some CG shots, particularly those that involve CGI rats in zero gravity, that do look pretty fake. Missteps for sure, but certainly not enough to sink the film. I.S.S. is a nice, sturdy little sci-fi thriller. That's all it's really aspiring to be, and it mostly pulls off what it wants. While I do think maybe 1 or 2 more rewrites to the script could have elevated the material into being something genuinely great, it's not like this is bad filmmaking or anything. I did like the film, but it never really escapes the nagging suspicion that it could have been better. It almost feels like a great movie, like it's just out of its reach. But I'll happily take a film that's good that could have been great instead of a film that couldn't even achieve basic goodness. I.S.S. gets a half full shot. And I guess that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching. As always, if you want to see my early thoughts of any film I watch or to read more of my reviews, make sure to check out my Letterboxd account. The link to that is in the description below. And make sure that you're subscribed so that you don't miss any upcoming reviews. Have a good day, and I'll see you next time.